Hi everyone, thank you very much for watching my video presentation. For this presentation I'm going to be discussing T.S. Eliot's essay Hamlet and His Problems from 1919, or in some editions it's simply referred to as Hamlet. Now I'm going to have some discussion questions posted at the end of this video, so if you'd like, feel free to address any of those questions in the comments section below in this discussion forum. Or if you have any concerns or other ideas about my presentation, I'd love to hear them. Alternatively, if you'd like to discuss some of these questions in class later today, that works for me as well. So to jump right in, I'll first just be providing a brief synopsis of this essay. So the essay was first published in the British literary journal The Athenaeum in September of 1919, and then it was subsequently included in Eliot's collection of essays titled The Sacred Wood in 1920. Now, to my mind, there's sort of two distinct sections in this essay. There's two sort of major takeaways we can take from the essay, I believe. The first being, Eliot discusses the critical work that has taken place on Hamlet, particularly around his time. And in these various pieces of criticism that are based on Hamlet, Eliot finds that there are a number of failures or successes depending on the way in which the critic looks at Hamlet, whether it's the critic is looking at the play as a whole or whether they're simply offering somewhat of a character analysis of Hamlet, the protagonist of the play. And the second point that I think we can get from this essay is that Eliot concludes that ultimately, Hamlet is what he describes as an artistic failure. He believes that the play doesn't sufficiently provide an adequate, what he refers to as an objective correlative, which is a term that I will describe later on in my presentation. So next, I'll just kind of give a brief kind of breakdown of these two major points. So to my first point, Eliot opens the essay by suggesting that too much critical attention is paid to Hamlet the character, while these critics ignore the play as a whole. So for example, Eliot critiques Goethe and Samuel Taylor Coleridge's analyses of the play for this very thing. Eliot suggests that neither of these men, in writing about Hamlet, remembered that his first business was to study a work of art. So rather than simply studying the play, Eliot finds that these critics are simply providing a character analysis of Hamlet, the character. And alternatively, Eliot praises two works of Hamlet criticism that had been published in 1919 by E.E. Stoll and J.M. Robertson. And now in these works, Eliot finds that there's more acknowledgement that Hamlet is what he refers to as a stratification in sort of the geological sense of the word. Rather than Shakespeare coming up with Hamlet all on his own, these critics acknowledge the fact that Hamlet is very much based on prior source material. So in this way, these critics, again, they see Hamlet as a stratification in that the play is built upon layers of previously published works that Shakespeare variably borrowed from. And Robertson specifically notes that Hamlet may have been based on a lost 16th century play that may or may not have been written by the playwright Thomas Kyd, and this play is now known as the Ur-Hamlet. So overall, Eliot simply praises these two critics in particular, who are interested in not just an analysis of Hamlet the character, but are looking at the play in a more kind of broad historical sense, and analyzing the possible source materials for this play. And now in these two analyses, these kind of open up an avenue by which Eliot can critique Hamlet, the play, in that Eliot finds the play fails to provide a sufficient objective correlative that's equivalent to Hamlet's emotions that he's expressing in the play. So Eliot suggests that the play is ultimately an artistic failure because it is full of some stuff that Shakespeare could not drag to light. And Eliot comes to this suggestion because while in the earlier source material that Hamlet is based on, the character is simply troubled by the effect of the mother's guilt onto her son, whereas in Shakespeare's version of the play, the protagonist's motives are muddled and unclear. So Eliot notes that in Shakespeare's version of the play, Gertrude plays a somewhat comparatively minor role as she does in the earlier source materials for this play. And so in that sense, Hamlet's motivations are not totally clear, and he doesn't have a sufficient avenue by which he can express those emotions. So in essence, Eliot is suggesting that Hamlet's emotions cannot be expressed because the facts and the actions of the play in Shakespeare's version are not equivalent to the emotion that the character feels. And so this is where Eliot introduces the concept of the objective correlative. Eliot defines this as a set of objects, a situation, chain of events, which shall be the formula of that particular emotion, such that when the external facts, which must terminate in sensory experience, are given, the emotion is immediately evoked. And now, essentially, an objective correlative is a group of things or events or figures of speech or literary devices that are used to represent emotions and thereby evoke that emotion in the audience. So Eliot seems to suggest that the brooding melancholy and these uncertain motivations that Hamlet has in Shakespeare's version of the play, they're not some sort of artistic feat of a enigmatic character, but instead they're rather a failure to provide a sufficient objective correlative that can evoke Hamlet's emotions in the audience. So in terms of my assessment of this essay, there's two major things that I think are going on here that it's important to address. And so specifically, I think we see in the alignment with Eliot's earlier essay, The Tradition and the Individual Talent, that Eliot's suggesting that there is the possibility for an objective experience of art, which I think is somewhat problematic in Eliot's estimation of this supposed objective experience. And secondly, I think this idea of the objective correlative touches on some of the tensions of representation as they're expressed in modernist literature versus modernist art, which I will get to by the end of my presentation. So first, I think it's no coincidence that this essay appeared in the same collection of essays as Eliot's essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent. And I think particularly the second section of the Tradition essay, in which Eliot describes the mind of a mature poet as this mind that can detach itself from its emotional register while it's engaged in the creative process. I think that particular point fits very well and aligns itself very well with Eliot's contention of the necessity of an objective correlative. So Eliot suggests in the Tradition essay that the more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and the mind which creates. So Eliot's ultimately suggesting that poetry should not be a personal expression. He further explains that poetry is not the expression of personality, but rather an escape from personality. And so I think in this essay, Eliot is suggesting that the artist must never impose themselves between the reader and their work of art. So if we consider this in conjunction with the idea of the objective correlative, this sort of becomes a method by which the artist or the writer can maintain control over their audience or reader by trying to set things up in such a way that the reader is inevitably led to feel an emotion without consciously being aware that the artist or the writer is trying to do this or trying to have this end goal of having the audience or reader have this emotional experience. And it's sort of a somewhat subversive method of ultimately coming to the ultimate goal, which is to stir this emotion in your audience or reader. And now, so I think it's also important to consider the fact of the scientific metaphor that Eliot uses in this second section of the Tradition and Individual Talent, because I think it adds to what I see as somewhat of a paternalistic understanding of the role of the artist. So in the Tradition essay, Eliot uses the analogy of a catalyst to explain his understanding of the poetic mind. If you'll remember, he discusses the mixing of two gases and the piece of filament, and the piece of filament is intended to stay the same even though the gases combine to make a sulfuric acid, I believe. So Eliot suggests that if certain conditions are met and things unfold in a particular manner, then you'll inevitably end up with this ideal mind of a poet. And now, in much the same way, Eliot uses a similar mode of thought in his concept of the objective correlative. Eliot assumes that particular poetic techniques presented in a particular fashion will result in a predictable and inevitable emotional response that is evoked in the reader or the audience. And so I think this mistakenly assumes that there can be an objective experience of art based on some preset conditions. And I think it further assumes that, particular literary tropes or figures of speech or images will elicit the same response in all audience members, which I think is somewhat problematic in the sense that it assumes that, or it sort of lessens the importance of, cultural context, gendered context, class context, racial context. All of these things I think Eliot somewhat ignores in suggesting that there can be an objective experience of art based on, particular tropes or images or figures of speech or what have you. And now, so this leads me to my second point, my second critique of this essay. And now to my second critique of this essay, I think Eliot mistakenly applies the representation that he is familiar with in poetry to the standards of representation that are expected in a piece of drama, such as Hamlet, which is a piece of work that is meant to be performed on stage. So interestingly, in the piece of drama, obviously we have sort of a hybrid between visual art and literary arts. And I think this mistaken comparison sort of exemplifies one of the tensions of applying the label of modernist to all types of art equally, which I think Pericles Lewis briefly discusses in his introduction to the Cambridge Intro to Modernism. So it's first important to note that Eliot does identify one example of an objective correlative in a Shakespearean tragedy. He points to Macbeth, and he believes that this play does adequately provide a sufficient objective correlative. And he suggests that in the play, particularly with Lady Macbeth, the state of mind of Lady Macbeth walking in her sleep has been communicated to you, the audience, by a skillful accumulation of imagined sensory impressions. So, in essence, to display the mental anguish that Lady Macbeth is feeling, she is portrayed sleepwalking or in a semi-conscious state, and thereby the audience is allowed insight into her psyche. But again, I think Eliot here is relying too heavily on the importance of dialogue in its ability to display an objective correlative and to evoke an emotional response in the audience or the reader. So as Eliot does suggest, the action in Hamlet, as opposed to the actions of Lady Macbeth in displaying her internal strife, the actions in Hamlet, alternatively, do not serve to sufficiently express his internal strife or his intense emotions to the audience. However, I think Eliot fails to realize or appreciate the alternative methods of artistic representation that are available in theater and thereby can express an objective correlative. And I think it's part of the beauty of Hamlet, is that this enigmatic character sort of allows for such a number of interpretations that it lends itself extremely well to directors to create Hamlet anew each time the character is presented on stage. So if a director decides to portray Hamlet as entirely a victim of circumstance, or for example as a fully autonomous character with conscious power to control his scenario, then things such as lighting or costumes or set design or props can do a lot of work to create these portrayals of Hamlet, which may not be readily apparent if one only considers the dialogue and the stage directions. But I can see where Eliot is coming from as a poet, because in poetry, the artist is somewhat confined to just simply the page, and thereby the poet is sort of much more beholden to their reader in terms of interpretation. So I think a poet can desire this control over interpretation that a playwright knows that they will ultimately and necessarily have to somewhat relinquish to a director. So in Pericles Lewis's introduction to the Cambridge Intro to Modernism, he identifies the mistake that Eliot makes by conflating a play with other forms of literature. Because Lewis notes that while visual artists were free to break from tradition in an extreme way by embracing abstract modes of representation, literature by its very nature had to somewhat cling to reality because it still must rely on language to express itself. Whereas plays have a greater degree, comparatively, of freedom in utilizing visual representation to elicit a particular emotional response. So that's my presentation. Again, here are some of the discussion questions. Feel free to address any of these in the comment section below, or we can discuss some of them in class later today. But thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to discussing this essay further with all of you. Thanks very much.